Adapt or die. Pragmatic leaders do what it takes. Next up, session 13, part 3. Analyze provider performance problems. Does the teacher have a can-do problem due to inadequate resources? Does the teacher have a can-do problem? Teacher can't produce the desired student result. Measure the most recent teacher performance with the student. Make a checklist for measurement and teaching procedures that the teacher has been asked to implement. Count the number of steps implemented correctly and the measure of the duration of the procedure. If the teacher is implementing the procedure correctly and consistently, but the student is still not meeting progress goals, then the teacher has a can-do problem. If you take a look at this chart of the teacher's performance across consecutive calendar days, you can see that as I showed you before, in baseline, before any additional staff training, the teacher demonstrated a know-how problem because her number of incorrectly implemented steps in the teaching procedure were much higher than the correctly implemented steps per minute in the procedure, and way below the goal of 20 correctly implemented steps per minute for this procedure. So we implemented staff training, and you can see how her performance changed. So eventually she got up to 20 correctly implemented steps per minute or higher, and the errors dropped out. So once you don't see any more red diamonds, that means there were 0 incorrectly implemented steps per minute. So is teacher implementing correctly by the last measure? Yes. Of course, this means that we solved the know-how problem, if you remember, from the analysis. Now let's see what happened to the student's performance and progress. Is the student meeting the progress goals when the teacher performs correctly? So remember, you're seeing how the teacher's performance improved until she was performing perfectly, 20 correctly implemented steps per minute with no errors. And what happens to the student's progress? It gets worse. The better the teacher performs, the worse the student gets. So no, the student was not meeting progress goals when teacher performs correctly. So what does that mean? Does the teacher have a can-do problem due to inadequate resources? Yes. The teacher implements correctly and consistently after we solved the know-how problem by providing additional training, yet the student continues to regress. The better the teacher gets, the worse the student gets. So that's conclusive evidence that the teacher had a can-do problem due to inadequate resources. So what are the causes of the teacher can-do problems due to inadequate resources? In other words, what could be wrong with the teacher resources? Is information missing or inadequate for the teacher? Yes. The teacher lacked valid measures of client preferences. What about inaccurate and unclear documentation of procedures? Yes. Remember, the procedures weren't written in a checklist format. They were written in a kind of vague, paragraph in which it was very hard to figure out exactly what one was supposed to do, even if you knew what to do, especially for a new teacher. Were the procedures, teaching procedures, or other procedures missing or inadequate? Yes. The procedure that she was using required a low rate of practice opportunities for the student. So the better she implemented the procedure after the additional training, the lower the rate of practice opportunities for the student. Now, why is that important? Well, we've done some research which showed that a high rate of practice opportunities produce more efficient progress than a low rate of practice opportunities. There was also an inefficient least to most prompting procedure, which not only was difficult to implement, but also further reduced the possible rate of practice opportunities the teacher could present. And there were consequences that did not appear to function as reinforcers. Were tools missing or inadequate? Yes. There were no charting tools that would allow the teacher and the supervisor to see whether the student was making efficient progress, to identify as soon as possible when the student was struggling, and that changes need to be made in the teacher's resources, training, or management. No audio video recording to improve the accuracy of measures. So here's the procedure that the teacher was implementing. See if you can find the design flaws in the eye contact teaching procedure, the current procedure. So if you look at step one, appropriate conditions when student is not looking at the teacher is to say the student's name. What could possibly be wrong with that? So I consider that to be inappropriate practice. It doesn't provide appropriate practice, meaning that it's not going to provide practice that will produce appropriate discrimination and generalization. So if you remember back to the content analysis, in order to teach, this is a discrimination on the student's part, right? So the student should only be looking at the teacher when the teacher says the student's name, not when the teacher says somebody else's name or the student's already looking at the teacher or whatever. So unless the procedure allows for practice that will produce appropriate discrimination generalization, it's inappropriate practice. How about number 2A? If student makes eye contact within 5 seconds, provide edible, tangible, plus praise and report as independent. What could be wrong with that? I think those are reinforcement errors because there's no evidence. There was no procedure that would establish and test whether or not those consequences were functioning as reinforcers. There was no regular preference assessment. There was no procedure for establishing praise as a condition reinforcer. Nothing. 2B, if student engages in any other behavior, block behavior, end trial, record error in comments section, repeat step 1 after 10 seconds. What could be wrong with that? It's a rate of practice error. So if you follow this, which after additional training, the teacher performed perfectly, you maximize the number of practice opportunities per minute at maybe 1 every 10 seconds, right? And actually much lower, because if you look at the last step, if student does not respond within 2 seconds, provide least and most prompts, full prompt, partial prompt, verbal, or independent, according to current prompt delay step 0, 5, or 10. Not only is that very difficult to implement accurately, but also I think it's a prompting error because what it does is it further reduces the possible rate of practice opportunities. Adapt or die. Pragmatic leaders do what it takes. Next up, session 14. Recommend solutions and solve provider performance problems.